Humiliation burns deeper than betrayal. You can hide a wound, but not the memory of a crowd laughing at your expense. My name is Emily, and the man who tried to humiliate me wasn't a stranger. It was my own boss, Daniel Hayes. To the world, Daniel was the kind of executive people admired. Sharp suit, polished smile, always a joke ready for the boardroom. But to those of us beneath him, he was something else entirely. A puppeteer who thrived on control. And I was his favorite puppet. At least, I used to be. I had worked under Daniel for 3 years at Graymont and Company, a marketing firm that thrived on appearances. I was the dependable one, the one who cleaned up mistakes, stayed late, made him look brilliant when he was anything but. He praised me in private, promised promotions, dangled opportunities just close enough to keep me loyal. But Daniel's praise was a double-edged sword. What he gave with one hand, he took with the other. In meetings, he'd cut me off mid-sentence. At networking events, he'd joke about my inexperience, my clothes, my single status. Laughter would ripple through the room, and though he always followed with, "I'm just teasing," the sting never faded. He knew exactly what he was doing. And yet, I stayed. Because I believed that if I worked hard enough, if I proved myself, eventually he'd respect me. That's the trap of men like Daniel. They build you up just enough to keep you hoping. The breaking point came one Friday afternoon. The office was buzzing, people gathering for the weekly wrap-up, drinks clinking in the break room. Daniel stepped into the center like he always did, commanding attention, eyes sparkling with the confidence of someone who thought he was untouchable. "Everyone," he announced, "I'd like to thank Emily here for her dedication. Without her, half my emails wouldn't even get spell-checked." The room chuckled. My face burned. He wasn't finished. He went on, spinning stories of my supposed mistakes, exaggerating details until I was painted as the office fool. People laughed harder than they should have, laughter that echoed in my chest like thunder. He smiled at me then, the kind of smile that said, "What will you do, Emily?" "Nothing, right?" I laughed along weakly. But inside, something cracked. That night, I lay awake replaying it, my shame growing sharper with every replay. But beneath the shame was something else, something colder. For the first time, I wondered, what if Daniel wasn't untouchable? What if the man who thrived on humiliating others could be brought to his knees? High voltage, I didn't have the answers yet. But as I drifted into restless sleep, one thought refused to leave me. If he enjoyed making me the punchline, I would make sure the world laughed at him instead. And in that thought, unease curled in my stomach, not fear of what he might do, but of what I was about to become. After that Friday, the office felt smaller somehow, like the walls were leaning in to watch me fail. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. Daniel had always been a character. But the signs kept stacking, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. It started with the phone calls. Daniel's cell would buzz during meetings. He'd step into the hallway, murmuring something about clients, but the tone, soft, amused, didn't match his explanation. Sometimes I'd catch him texting with a smirk that never reached his eyes. He claimed it was work, but I noticed patterns, calls only at certain hours, messages quickly deleted. Then there was favoritism. He'd praise Jordan, the new assistant, for small achievements, while my own contributions were dismissed or ignored. "Emily, you're reliable as always," he'd say in passing, a smile hiding something colder underneath. Reliability was code for invisible, someone who could be leaned on but never recognized. Meanwhile, Jordan's mistakes were excused, her successes paraded in front of clients. Even money started to feel strange. I noticed reimbursements that hadn't gone through, petty expenses mysteriously missing from my accounts, small amounts that added up over weeks. When I asked Daniel about them, he brushed it off. "Oh, just a clerical error. Don't worry, Emily. I'll handle it." But I did worry. Worse was the atmosphere he created. The jokes he made in the office, the friendly teasing at meetings, the subtle digs in front of clients. It wasn't harmless. It was a game he seemed to enjoy, and I was always the target. I noticed colleagues laughing politely, but some cast sideways glances as if they weren't sure whether to sympathize or just keep quiet. The emotional strain was exhausting. I found myself second-guessing every decision, every word I spoke. Did I dress wrong? Speak too fast? Fail to smile enough? My confidence, once steady, began to erode, replaced by this gnawing tension that clung to me at my desk, at home, even when I closed my eyes at night. One evening, I overheard him in his office, murmuring into the phone, just loud enough for me to hear, "Don't worry, she won't notice, yet." My chest tightened. I couldn't tell what he meant. Was it a work plan? A joke? Or something else? The uncertainty gnawed at me. For the first time, I realized Daniel's control wasn't just over tasks or schedules, it was over perception, over how others saw me, over how I saw myself. And while no one could prove it yet, a shadow of doubt began to grow. Perhaps Daniel wasn't just a bully. Perhaps he was hiding something bigger. High voltage, and that shadow planted a seed in my mind. If he could manipulate perception so easily, maybe he could be exposed, and I could turn the tables. If only I had the courage to see what he was really hiding. I had half a mind to ignore it. To pretend the emails, the receipts, and the whispered conversations didn't exist. But the truth, as it always does, had a way of breaking through. And when it hit like a punch to the chest. It was late one night when I stayed behind at the office, pretending to finish reports while the rest of the team left. Daniel had left his laptop open, careless, arrogant, and exactly the opportunity one needed. A folder labeled Special Projects caught my eye. I clicked. Inside were documents that spelled out everything he had been doing behind my back, altering project budgets to siphon company funds into accounts he controlled, inflating his own bonuses, and quietly undermining my work so that I would appear incompetent in front of clients. Every deal I had contributed to, every pitch I had stayed late to perfect, had been twisted to make me look like a fool. And worse, there were emails between him and a competitor, detailing plans to take my ideas and present them as his own, then claiming the credit publicly. He wasn't just humiliating me in private. He had been systematically dismantling my professional reputation. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. My chest ached, but not from fatigue. It was betrayal, the kind that cuts deeper than disappointment, sharper than anger. The man who had smiled in my face, who had called me reliable, had been laughing at me in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. I sank into the chair, clutching my head. Heartbreak, disbelief, rage, they all tangled together in a tight knot that made it hard to breathe. How could someone I trusted so completely, someone who had promised loyalty and mentorship, do this? Did he think I was stupid? Did he think no one would notice? As I sat there, I felt a cold clarity start to settle over the fire of anger. This wasn't just humiliation. This wasn't just petty office politics. This was deliberate, calculated sabotage, and it had a name. Daniel Hayes had underestimated me. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I imagined him on his knees, begging, desperate, powerless. Not in a fantasy of cruelty, but as a necessary vision of what justice might look like. The thought brought a strange calm over me. My heartbreak had forged a blade of resolve. I wouldn't cry, I wouldn't plead, and I certainly wouldn't forgive, not yet. I would plan. I would wait. I would turn his own arrogance against him. High voltage, and as I closed the laptop, one thought refused to leave my mind. If he thought he could destroy me with humiliation, he had no idea the storm he had just provoked. The next morning, I walked into the office with a calm I didn't feel. My hands were steady, my smile neutral, but inside, a storm raged. The betrayal still burned, but grief had sharpened into something colder, sharper, a quiet resolve. I replayed the events in my head, the laughter, the mocking tone of his voice, the way he had carefully orchestrated my humiliation to look like incompetence. At first, I'd felt powerless, angry, and humiliated, but then a realization struck me. Daniel's power wasn't absolute. It was fragile. His control depended entirely on others believing his version of reality. And if I could expose it, if I could make others see the truth, his empire of mockery would crumble. The trigger moment came that afternoon. I overheard him in a client call, bragging about the loyalty of his team, casually taking credit for work I had spearheaded. His voice was smug, full of certainty, as if nothing could touch him. That certainty, that arrogance, was his weakness. I leaned against my desk, heart hammering, and thought, he thinks I'm broken. He thinks I'll stay silent. He's wrong. From that moment, my plan solidified. I would not confront him directly, not yet. I would gather proof, document every lie, every act of sabotage, every manipulated client email. I would use his own hubris against him, letting him believe he remained untouchable while I quietly built the case that would expose him. Emotionally, the shift was profound. Where before I had flinched at his jokes, now I watched with an analytical eye. Each smirk, each subtle dig, each boast became a clue, a piece of ammunition. Hurt had become focus, pain had become strategy, and humiliation had become fuel. That evening, I sat alone in the office, the city lights stretching below the windows, and felt the first spark of something that had been buried for too long: power. Not cruel power, not the kind Daniel had wielded over me, but measured, deliberate, unstoppable power. I had endured his games, survived his ridicule, and now I could turn the tables. High voltage, he had tried to humiliate me, to reduce me to a punchline, but what he didn't understand was that humiliation only made me stronger. And the stronger I became, the more unstoppable I would be. As I closed my notebook, one thought lingered. I wasn't just going to survive Daniel Hayes, I was going to make him wish he had never underestimated me. Revenge, I decided, would be surgical, not loud, not messy, but precise. Daniel had built his fortress on charm and misdirection. To bring it down, I needed a map, where the stones were loose, how the mortar had been mixed, which doors he kept unlocked. So I made a list and started checking boxes. I spent evenings at my desk after everyone left, opening the files Daniel thought he hid behind jargon. Budgets with ghost line items. Draft emails where he rewrote my proposals and sent them as his own. Screenshots of chats where he coached a client to complain about Emily's errors so he could swoop in. I printed, timestamped, and backed everything up on a thumb drive I hid in a book on my shelf, books no one touched. No emotion, only evidence. I reached out to people he couldn't charm with bravado. An HR rep who quietly hated his jokes, a former intern who'd been bumped aside for promotion, and a compliance officer at a partner firm who'd once hinted about odd reimbursements. I didn't tell them my plan. I showed them documents. Their faces changed from skepticism to alarm. One by one, they agreed to be witnesses, discreet, professional, unshakable. We drafted anonymous, but formal queries, an internal audit request flagged as routine, a client note asking for clarification on billable hours, a soft tip to a small industry reporter about unusual bonuses. Nothing illegal, only friction that made people look twice. If Daniel's books were clean, these inquiries would fizzle. If they weren't, they'd force him to explain in front of people who actually checked the ledgers. He loved applause. He lived for company parties where his grin stole the spotlight. So I planned the party, our firm's quarterly celebration at the rooftop bar. I invited the right mix: board members, a few long-suffering colleagues, and the compliance officer I'd befriended. I would be the composed employee who accidentally produced a file for a client question. The file would be the sting. All the while, Daniel strutted through the office like a king with a crown. He posted a photo of himself in a tux that week, smug, confident, untouchable. That arrogance calmed me. It meant I was invisible. He still believed the narrative he'd written about me: timid, grateful, laughable. But tension tightened like a wire. Late nights stacking documents, hushed phone calls with reluctant witnesses, and the strange thrill of knowing the next move could topple everything made my pulse quicken. I rehearsed my face, calm, bewildered, betrayed, so when the moment came, no one would suspect performance. Then, 2 days before the party, while copying a final folder, I found something I hadn't expected: a single encrypted document buried in a subfolder labeled, simply, Plan B. I hadn't touched the file. I hadn't seen that label before. For the first time since I'd started, a thin thread of unease crawled under my skin. Whatever Plan B was, it suggested he wasn't as unprepared as I'd hoped. The night of the quarterly celebration arrived like the calm before a storm. The rooftop was lit with fairy lights, glasses clinked, and Daniel moved among the guests with that self-satisfied grin, convinced that his empire of charm and deceit remained untouchable. He had no idea that the storm was already inside the building, and it was aimed directly at him. I approached the table where a few board members were reviewing year-end reports. With a calm smile, I said, "Daniel, I think there's a discrepancy in these files. Maybe you can clarify?" He laughed lightly, not seeing the hidden cameras that I had set to record reactions, the files I had printed and labeled, the whispers that would soon reach the right ears. When he leaned over, ready to charm and smooth the issue away, I pressed play on the slideshow I had cued on the projector behind us. One by one, emails, documents, and screenshots appeared, evidence of his manipulation, his sabotage of my projects, and the siphoning of company funds into personal accounts. Laughter from the crowd froze into shocked murmurs. Faces that had cheered his jokes moments before turned pale as recognition dawned. Daniel's smile faltered. "Emily, this isn't. It's exactly this," I interrupted. "For months, you've humiliated me, undermined me, and lied to everyone in this room. I have proof. And now, so does everyone else." A hush fell. Phones came out, people began recording, and murmurs escalated into whispers that spread across the rooftop like wildfire. The compliance officer I had quietly recruited stepped forward, confirming each document and transaction with cold precision. Colleagues who had endured subtle jabs and public jokes finally had someone to back their quiet suspicions. Daniel tried to interrupt, tried to spin, tried to charm, but each move fell flat. His once commanding voice trembled as I calmly outlined each betrayal, stolen credit, manipulated deals, and deliberate humiliation meant to make me appear incompetent. Investors in attendance exchanged grim looks. A few quietly excused themselves to make calls. Samantha, his assistant who had laughed along at his jokes, stepped back, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. The controlled Daniel had relied on his confidence, his public persona crumbled in real time. By the time the police liaison and corporate auditors arrived, summoned discreetly ahead of the event, the man who had tried to humiliate me was left exposed, his financial crimes documented, his reputation shredded. His colleagues and friends watching the spectacle of his unraveling. The room was silent except for the soft clack of phones capturing every frame. I stood at the edge of the rooftop, calm and unshaken, as Daniel was escorted out. Once, he had been untouchable. Now, he was reduced to pleading, embarrassed, and powerless. High voltage, and as the city lights stretched below us, I realized that the humiliation he had tried to inflict on me had returned to him tenfold, but more than that, it had cemented my strength. The man who thought he could destroy me had unknowingly forged the version of myself capable of taking him down completely. The days after the rooftop confrontation felt surreal. Daniel Hayes, the man who had once made the office quake with his ego, was now a cautionary tale. News outlets picked up the story, his embezzlement, the sabotage of my projects, and the humiliation he had orchestrated all laid bare. Investors withdrew support, colleagues distanced themselves, and even the social media posts he had curated to showcase his success became ironic footnotes to his disgrace. I returned to the office for the first time since the exposure, walking through the familiar halls with a calm I hadn't felt in years. The laughter, the whispers, the sideways glances, they were different now. People looked at me with respect, not pity. Emails I once sent that were ignored were now read carefully, acknowledged, and appreciated. My name, once used as the punchline of his jokes, carried weight. Financially, Daniel's schemes had been frozen and reversed wherever possible, ensuring he couldn't regain his footing quickly. Professionally, I had reclaimed my projects, my accounts, and even the trust of clients who had once doubted me. But beyond money and career, the greatest victory was intangible. I had taken back my power, my voice, and my dignity. Yet, even in victory, there was a sliver of unease. A week later, I found an anonymous envelope slipped under my office door. Inside was a single printed note, "You've won today. But the game isn't over. Be careful who you trust." I didn't panic. I didn't even feel anger. But the reminder that someone or something could still watch, still maneuver, was enough to keep me vigilant. Power was satisfying, but it was also a responsibility, and I wouldn't let my guard down again. Sitting at my desk, sipping coffee as the morning sunlight spilled over the city skyline, I realized something important. Revenge had been sweet, but freedom was sweeter. The humiliation he had tried to inflict on me had returned to him tenfold, but the awareness that danger still lingered added a layer of respect for the thin line between victory and vulnerability. High-voltage poetic justice isn't always loud or explosive. It's quiet, inevitable, and lingering. He begged for forgiveness, but in the end, it was I who chose the terms of the aftermath. Now, let me ask you, have you ever been humiliated or betrayed by someone you trusted completely? Did you stay silent, or did you fight back? Share your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you want more stories of betrayal, cunning, and justice, subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes, surviving is only the beginning, and the quietest victories are the ones that echo the longest.